Well, do you think we should start? All right, okay. We're a huge crowd here tonight. Everybody who's sensible has stayed home and is watching online. And if you're watching online, hi, you're sensible. It's a very cold, wet night. And I know some will be watching the YouTube version of this later. And we kind of welcome you as well, whenever you watch. Belief in God. God for me is quite fundamental. It's quite, for me, opening myself to God is really an essential part of my being. But I also like to think about it, and I'm here really to help or assist and stimulate your thinking about it. My dad used to say to me, never be afraid to ask questions. And in my teenage years, as my faith developed, I kind of imagined that God was saying that too. Never be hesitant about asking questions. So please come in and look who's coming. My friend is here. Hello there. Ah, yes, it's so nice to see you. Yes, it is. Oh, yes, it is. Come in out of the cool and the wet. Right. Elliot, there you go.
Oh, I can smell that wet dog smell. Come here.
Oi.
Oi.
Okay, so we were... Oh, there's more coming. Well, I think we should just hold off a little bit while people come in. I could ramble on, as a minister, I should know how to do that. So congratulations if you've come in out of the cold. And really, this calls into question your common sense why you didn't stay home in the warm. But anyway, greetings. And we're going to talk about God. And I was saying it's really an important issue for me, but I also like to think about it. And I was saying before, my dad used to say, don't be afraid to ask questions. And in my teenage years of faith, I also imagined God saying that too. It's okay to ask questions and to question your faith, to use your brain, and that's what I want to do. I want to share with you my reflections. When you're talking about God, no one's reflections are going to be okay. Like, we're all going to be inadequate, so I'm sharing my reflections. They won't necessarily match yours, but it'll possibly lead us to have a bit of a discussion about things. I'm doing this in two parts. In the first part, I'm talking about common pathways to belief in God. And I'm going to look at positive and negative sides of that. And then I'm going to have a break and we'll have questions and discussion. And then the second half, I want to talk about, well, belief in God as I see it and what's meaningful for me and may be meaningful for you. So let me start with one of the pathways. My theory is that, we begin in a womb, we're secure, right? And then we're thrust out, we're popped out into a bigger womb made up of our parents and maybe one or two other people. And then the womb, it keeps growing, and we carry into each of those settings a kind of yearning to belong. A kind of wanting to have a place for ourselves. And you could say that for some people that is a kind of a God-shaped thing, because the yearning to belong increases as the community increases until you're actually in the universe and you've got this God-shaped kind of yearning to belong. Now, you can use that as a good argument against belief in God. Like, belief in God is then a fantasy that you make up, you imagine God, coming out of that experience of what it's like to be in the womb and then gradually. Or you can see it quite positively and say, one of the ways of thinking about God is thinking about, can you belong in this universe? Like, is it all just empty beyond everything, or is there a sense of belonging that I can have? And that's a kind of God-shaped question, I say a God-shaped question because I think it comes out of our experiences. That's a psychological argument. Another argument, particularly in the ancient world, was that you had rulers. You know, they were usually all male, not all, and they were important because you needed to have people running the show, but they didn't run it necessarily well. And you can understand that they also began to say, well, is there a better ruler? Is there an ultimate ruler? And you can see too that that's a good argument against belief in God. It's just a fantasy. Or you can say, well, the question, is there any control? Like, is there anything, is there a ruler? Is there any sort of order? Those are kind of important questions, and I think they partly grow sociologically out of people's experiences. One of the other ways, of course, that's quite common is God is the explanation for things you can't explain. So God must be behind making rainbows because it's magic. And you'll know that there are some insurance policies that talk about acts of God, you know, meaning earthquakes and kind of things like that. So, you know, people have, especially in the ancient world and the pre-scientific world, they didn't see why things happened, so it must have been God. So God is used as an explanation for things we don't understand. The problem is that the more you do understand, and we do actually know how rainbows work. You can make your own rainbow using vapor, you know, and a torch. So there's no room for God there anymore, and the more we explain things and the better we get in science and understanding things, the less room there is for God. That sort of understanding of God. People call it the God of the gaps. So that kind of pathway to God kind of doesn't necessarily lead anywhere, but you can see that it was a pathway that people took, and if I can't explain it, it must be super. It must be a superpower. It must be a God. It must be God. The idea that there must be an origin of all things, of course, is there already in Jewish literature, collected in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis. And this is their belief that 6,000 years ago, counting from our time, the universe came into being. And it was made by God over 7 days, or 6 days, and then he had a rest. Like, this was their understanding, and God made the flat earth and the dome over the top, which was the heavens, and over the heavens went lights, including the sun and the moon, and the other little lights, the stars, sort of hung around and did all kinds of interesting things. Well, who started all that? Well, God the Creator did. Now, that's a very different world from ours, where we know, don't we, that the world is not flat. And we even know that it's not round with the sun going around it. But we are part of an enormous, mind-blowing, you know, we're part of with the planets, we're part of a solar system, we're part of a galaxy. And the latest I heard is that there are 2 trillion galaxies. I mean, that's absurd. I mean, you can't imagine that. So, you know, we are a long way from the people who wrote Genesis and were speculating about how God made things 6,000 years ago. We're talking about 13.8 billion years ago. And we're not even sure that's when it began. Did it have a beginning? Is there a beginning to time? And what about space? Is there out all those galaxies, 2 trillion galaxies, the latest person I had talking about it, who's a specialist. How can you imagine? You can't imagine space. We want to have an end to it, don't we? You know, space comes to an end. No, it doesn't. It goes on. We can't think that. Like it's infinity. We have really our minds are blown by that. And when you look at all of this, then my question is, well, why is there not nothing? You know, and that's a God-shaped question. Like, that doesn't give you a particular picture of God, but it's a kind of God-shaped question. Why is there not nothing? Like, there is something. So how do we explain all of that? Well, one theory, of course, is that God started it all, set it all rolling, set the whole evolutionary process of in the galaxies and everything, and then went to sleep. That's a lovely man there. I know him quite well, and he's having a sleep. But that's called deism. Like, it's kind of the absent God. It's almost like, okay, God is the first cause, but so what? You know, is it now as though God has gone to sleep? Like, it's not a very helpful idea, and yet it is in another way, because it does deal with it gets us thinking, why is there not nothing? Is there something? And our God ideas start partly from that. Our God ideas are also influenced by historical understanding in Jewish literature in particular, in the Old Testament. And you know that in the early times, Yahweh, Israel's God, wrongly translated into English as Jehovah, it's Yahweh. Israel's God was the God of their land. And there was a God of Canaan, of that bit over there, and there was a God of Italy, and there was a God of Spain, and whatever. And you know the story of Naaman the Syrian, who came and Elisha healed him. What did he want to do? He scooped up some of the soil from Israel and went back home because he'd wanted to have Yahweh with him. You know, it's fascinating, isn't it? And then, you know, there was an evolution in thought, in Hebrew thought, that yes, there are other gods, but and they actually form a kind of a council. You actually get this in Psalm 82. God takes his place in the council of the gods. Yeah? There are other gods, but Israel's the key God. He's the top, I was going to say the top dog, the top God. Get the word dyslexically read the other way round. And so this is how they began to think that God is in fact the head God. And then they went on from there to say, no, actually, God is the only God. Particularly as they had the experience of going into the exile, into Iran, and experiencing the wider world. Our God must be connected to all of that. The other gods, well, the Hebrew word for God and for an angel is Elohim. So they said, oh, well, those are Elohim. They're not actually gods. They're angels. So they began to think in terms of God, of the universe, well, their little universe, and the angels, who are a kind of council. In the book of Job, you've got a sort of council meeting where the role of one of the angels is to be a prosecutor. He's called Satan. It's interesting. There's all kinds of fascinating things about this development. But they moved towards the belief that there's only one God. And a sense of the loftiness of God meant that they began to say, well, and you get this sometimes, like at the burning bush, Moses. Is it God who came, or is it the angel of the Lord who came? Like sometimes they kind of have an angel or almost like an extension of God, and similarly with the Spirit. So they talk about God above and the Spirit coming down. It's actually God, but kind of it's the beginning of the doctrine of the Trinity, really, but that was one of the early developments. Israel's thinking about God was interesting because one of the theories was that God was in control. And if they were good, they would win their battles, and if they were bad, they'd lose them. And there's a whole swathe of literature going from Judges right through Samuel, Kings, which are written on the basis of this philosophy, that the wicked suffer and the good are rewarded. Now, as you can imagine, as time went on, some of the experiences which Israel had were actually pretty negative. And they began to say, well, actually, and Ezekiel does this, actually, it can't really be like that, because some of the really awful nations are doing so well. It's kind of not right. And so you get Israel thinking or rethinking its understanding of God along the lines of, well, yes, sometimes the righteous, the good, will actually suffer and the wicked will prosper. And it'll have to be sorted out one day. There will be a day of the Lord, and the Lord will come and will conduct judgment, and things will be made fair, but it's not fair at the moment. And they also began to think, well, Job was a good fellow, and he suffered. It was all kind of organised from on high, but it does happen like this, that sometimes people are going through rough times, or a nation is, and it doesn't mean that they're bad. So they began to give up this notion of good people succeed and bad people don't. And they began to say, well, actually, it ain't necessarily so. And then, of course, what happened is that they began to develop a theory that really, yes, God is around, but so are other powers. There was a myth that went along the lines of some angels were really fond of the women, the human women that they saw, and fell in love with them or raped them. Just depends on how you read the story. But the outcome was that these women gave birth to giants, a mixed kind of race thing, gave birth to giants. And the giants fought each other, they killed each other, and out of their corpses came half human, half divine things called evil spirits, unclean spirits. And it's interesting that some of them are named, and they're given the names of illnesses. So this whole universe, well, their little universe, their earth, was kind of populated with these forces. So there was God's forces, or God's angels, or sometimes the Spirit of God, and there were the unclean spirits, and they began to understand God that way, they began to understand reality that way, and so they understood healing as exorcism. When the stories of Jesus are told, the assumption is he heals by dealing with the spirits, because the spirits, like personalised viruses, they have to be addressed and cast out. And Luke, when he rewrites the story of Jesus healing Peter's mother-in-law, actually has Jesus rebuke the fever. You can see the understanding behind that. It's demonology. So the world, their world, is in a chaotic state where you've got these competing forces, and what are you going to do about that? Well, the day of the Lord might come, but it actually had to be something bigger than that. And they began to talk about, actually, we'll need to smash it all up and start again. Like, we'll need to have a new heaven and a new earth. My goodness, these people in the past who were really awful people, and they're dead now, but they're not going to get away with it. We're going to bring them back to life. And they're going to have to face up to what they've done. And so the notion developed that there will be a judgment day. And of course, you've got to be present at the judgment day. So you don't exist if you're just a soul. You're a sort of shady creature under the earth, as they believed. No, they're going to have bodies. Not quite bodies like we've got, but they'll be embodied, and that means they'll be resurrected, raised from the dead. So that will sort it out, and that was very much the kind of thinking that was around about the turn of the millennia, which influences the way they thought about God and the way they thought about life in general. Another pathway to belief in God in that context was to say, well, God's active, so every now and again you'll see a miracle occur, and that's God, like a healing occurs, and so you find God in the miraculous, in the healings and the extraordinary things, and there are all sorts of questions about this. Occasional interventions undertaken by God, the demons do things too, like they cause storms, and Jesus is pictured as rebuking the storm, the wind and the waves. Why is he telling them off? Because there's a spirit there. That's how they understood it. Anyway, so you've got lots of stories about miracles, and people were fond of telling stories about miracles in the ancient world. Emperors told, fortunately our politicians don't do this, but emperors in the ancient world had a whole list of stories about the miraculous things they could do. And if you wanted to be an impressive teacher, you needed to be able to say, I can do this and this and this, and I can do the supernatural, extraordinary things. And of course, stories we have in our Gospels talk about miracles. Some of them are highly symbolic, but others, I mean, it's very hard to say they couldn't have happened. There must have been miraculous things, things that we couldn't explain, and maybe we still can't explain, but they happened. And so that was also a significant component as people believed in God, came to believe in God. I mean, there are also all sorts of counter questions, like if somebody was really able to multiply bread and feed thousands of people, why didn't he do it for the people who, there were millions of people who were hungry? Why didn't he do it? Like, is that a fair question? It's not really a fair question when you go back to them, because they weren't thinking like that. Or why didn't Jesus also authorize his disciples and all ministers and actually all lay people to be able to walk on water? It's actually very useful. You could rescue so many people. It's not fair to ask those questions. That's absurd. But miracles, extraordinary events, also were a little bit like God of the Gap stuff. They played a role. And I think, you know, I think we should be skeptical about skepticism, so I'm quite open to, there may be things that happen that I can't explain, and yeah, that's okay. But it's very interesting that a number of our New Testament writers, like Matthew and Mark and Paul and John, are not happy with faith based on miracles. I mean, the most dramatic incident is in John's Gospel about Nicodemus and people, the end of chapter 2, where the Gospel writer says, many people followed Jesus because of the miracles he did. They believed in his name, which is a term for becoming a Christian, but he didn't believe in them because he knew what was in them. Like, I don't want people following because of the wow factor. Nicodemus says, look, you must be from God. No one can do these things unless God's with you. Nicodemus, you've got to start all over again. You've got to be born again. Start all over again. Your thinking's all wrong. And without going into the details of the others, just briefly, Matthew, at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, he said, well, one day there'll be people coming up and saying, look, I've done this miracle and that miracle. And Jesus will say to him at the last day, I didn't know you. You haven't been doing what I've been talking about in the Sermon on the Mount. And Paul, of course, they didn't doubt miracles. They weren't as they didn't have the problems of credibility that we would have looking at these things. But Paul says, well, look, okay, well, the miracles and all these things. But you know really what the sign of God is? It's not all those things. It's love. And he wrote that famous chapter, 1 Corinthians 13. Really quite interesting kind of challenge to the way people were thinking about God. Now, I'm going to stop at this point, and we're going to have a conversation and any questions that you have. I think we're probably a small enough group not to say just talk amongst yourselves, but anyone want to just ask a question or make a comment? Don't feel you have to be comfortable with what I've said.
And we do want you to use the microphone for the people who are online.
Right. It just seems like all through history, people have always tried to find meaning to what's going on. And so you have interpretation of what's going on in the skies and the stars. The Romans are always watching about how the chickens ate, and if the chickens weren't eating their food, it wouldn't be a good day to go into battle. And it just seems like a universal sort of experience that people are trying to understand what is it all about and what does it all mean.
The question about looking at life and then saying, well, how can I find meaning in this particular experience? In a sense, the big question is actually quite legitimate. This universe, this immense thing, what is it all about? Has it got any meaning? Is it just an empty mass of evolving galaxies, or is it thinkable that there's some sense out there? Can't prove it, but I might choose to believe it. Yeah.
A number of astronauts who've gone a fair distance away, like to the moon, but have often made that comment that they look back and there is the Earth just alone there in the universe, and they found that a very disturbing experience in the world. What is this all about? They're a long way away, and yet they need to go home, and they're just troubled by this lonely planet.
And just generally astronomy, like just experiencing the stars, going out and looking, and I can't actually comprehend this notion of trillions of galaxies. I mean, that's absurd.
Yeah.
I just cannot. My mind can't. I don't have an adequate grasp of space, nor an adequate grasp of time. And so it's quite reasonable then to say, well, yeah, actually there may be more to it, Bill, than what you're seeing. Like thinking that there may be God, whatever we're talking about when we mean God, something more than my intelligence and our intelligence here. Surely there is. It's reasonable to say that. So kind of that connects us to the end. It's not unreasonable to say there is God. It may be unreasonable to say there is a God like that.
Sorry. Going in the other direction, biologists have talked about the amount of information that's in a single cell. And the amount of information in a single cell is simply vast.
Yes.
And you wonder, where on earth did that come from?
Yes.
And when you think of the vastness of outer space, you've also got to consider the vastness of a single cell.
Yeah, the intricacies that we're still kind of trying to find our way into. Yeah, exactly. Like it's the big things, and it's this. We have difficulty with that. And okay, what that does is it challenges our confidence that we've got answers to everything. It's okay not to know, and actually open yourself to the embrace of not knowing, because it's very creative. And then use your brain about what you're saying when you're being creative. Yeah. Others? Yeah.
It's more a comment from trying to think along those lines. I've been greatly helped recently by Ian McGilchrist's book about the left and right hemispheres of the brain, where he notes that they have completely different views of the world, and they live in the world in different worlds. They use the same data that comes into each one in completely different ways. And I think science is basically, his concern for the Western world at the moment is that our scientistic way of seeing the world is taking the left hemisphere's view of reality, which is graspable, grabbable, turnable for our own ends, and it's sort of deifying that and cutting off the ways of the right hemisphere that relate us to the rest of the world. And all of a sudden it's kind of brought vistas open for me to see, oh, the whole scientific endeavour is a left hemisphere's way of handling the world and grasping it and manipulating it. The right hemisphere is relating to all the different parts of it. And anyway, it's
Yeah.
made a lot of other options for me.
Yeah, and you know, in the world of science, we have actually moved away from the dogmatism of the scientific world having answers for everything. And it's actually scientists, astronomers and people who are now saying, hang on, let's acknowledge the fact that we don't know. And that's okay. Saying we don't know doesn't mean that gives me permission to make up fables, no? But it does teach me respect, and many scientists would embrace that. They mightn't go where we want to go in terms of what kind of God we're talking about. I mightn't want to do that either.
Bill, you're reading my mind, because my question is actually about a book I read a few years ago where the writer was saying that if you want to talk to scientists about is there an intelligence behind the universe, you no longer find an audience that's listening to the fact that there's no intelligence there among the physicists, because they have worked out in doing their sums, and this is what his book was all about, is that the chances of this Earth being in this position and supporting the kind of life that we have now is so monstrous in terms of trillions and trillions of possibilities. They say there has to be an intelligence there, otherwise we couldn't be who we are.
Yeah. It's really interesting, isn't it, that you know, it seems a very simple thing to say, but we're kind of acknowledging that we can't be the most intelligent beings in the universe. Come on, we're on planet Earth, you know, it's special, but it's one little bit, you know. Surely it's all much bigger than that. Yeah. Now, maybe we'll take one more question and then we'll swing on. Or should we just swing on? We'll just wait till Andrew to get back and then we'll swing on. So we're kind of talking about awe and wonder. And my thinking is that part of being open to believing that this possibility of God or godness or something like that has got to do with the more we are, if you like, openly scientific, open our minds, the more we actually take into account that we really are in an endless time and an endless space, the more what it does to our mind is it sort of opens our minds up. And okay, I mightn't have explanations. I might have to acknowledge that when I say this or that, I'm choosing to believe something that I can't prove. Yeah, that's okay. What I can do is embrace the awe. Whether I want to use the God language in that or not, I don't know. I mean, I do, because I've always done it. But embracing awe and wonder is a hugely significant thing for human beings. And the intricacy, I put vastness and intricacy. The intricacy of the tiny is in a way similar to that. This is a comet flying over Melbourne. We don't, of course, believe that God is up there, do we? You know, I think it's really quite funny when, you know, what's happened in the last couple of decades is that when people score a try in rugby league, you know, some of them say, you know, God help me to do it. And they point to God. The problem is that people doing that in Australia are pointing in the opposite direction to people who are in England, who are they're pointing to God down there somewhere. I mean, it's absurd. We don't live in a three-tiered universe. So the idea of God as above actually doesn't, it only makes sense to us as a metaphor. Like, language is often true because it's false. Huh? And this is one that's true because it's false. We say it, we believe it, but No. You know, Ascension Day, there's jokes about that. When Jesus ascended, did he go into orbit? You know, it's kind of funny, isn't it? Or is he on his way to a heaven which is right at the end of the many galaxies? Well, he's only about a tenth of the way there, or even less. I mean, this is absurd thinking. But what it's done to us is, particularly in the mid part of last century, is that people began to think about God and say, actually, we can also think about God as below, like, or within. Something called panentheism is believing that God is actually in all things, like not up there, not down there, but in here. And what believing in God is about being open to the Godness or the God energy that's in here, in you, in me, in our world. I mean, that's one way of thinking about it, making it different. So you develop a kind of spirituality, a sense of oneness with the world in which we live. And for some people it won't be using God language, but for others it will. One of the terms that was used in the mid part of last century was God as the ground of our being. Like it's a kind of spirituality that says, I need to be connected. I want to be connected. You know, think of myself as like a tree and allow the life of God, the love of God to come up through me. I'm talking mythical, symbolic language, but I don't know how to say it otherwise. And when you're talking about God, you're going to be talking inaccurately. You're going to be talking symbolically. None of our concepts is going to be adequate. You know, another response in last century, there was quite a lot of stuff published in the 60s and 70s. And one of the responses is to say, well, we should just shut up about God. It's not a bad idea, because so many people, their idea of God is not at all what we want to embrace. And just shut up about it. I mean, I can't. But I need to acknowledge that anything we're going to say is going to be pretty inadequate. Look, we can't even understand space and time. If we really are saying there's something in and beyond all of this, let's not kid ourselves that we're going to be able to describe it or talk about it adequately. So what happens then is that we resort to symbolic and mythical language. Some of the most significant things in our lives, experiences, are when we descend into using symbolic language. When we're in love, we say crazy things. You know, it's just nonsense, but it's poetry, symbolism, myth, imagery is really important as a way of giving expression to what we can't describe. And that's okay. You know, I've sometimes wondered, what if I chose only to sing those hymns and songs that I believe, that I can believe in? I'd find I wouldn't be able to sing many of them, you know. So for people like me who lead worship and others who might lead worship, one of our main responsibilities is that we are bearers of a tradition, and we need to use our nous to be critical about how you use symbolism, and not to have too many hymns that you don't believe, like that are saying things that, gosh, no, I don't. I mean, I find that my resolution is that I sometimes want to sing, Be Thou My Vision. I want to sing, oh, there's lots of them. And it's not as though I turn my intellect off, but it's actually a gut response. It represents a kind of openness. I'm expressing openness. It's a little bit like when people say the Lord's Prayer. Most people don't think what they're saying. They're doing it. You do the Lord's Prayer. And I think sometimes with the hymns you do that. But I do think that people who are leading worship need to be very careful. I've sung songs in this church and other churches and where I've thought, gosh, I hope people don't believe this. You know, I hope that, you know. So we've got to be critical about it, but at the same time embrace the fact that there's no alternative but to use symbolic language. But just know that some of it's better than others. God is not a person, like not a human being. Really? Of course, God's just a big guy. You know, of course, that's always the symbolism's been about God as a person. That's absurd when you think, you're really saying that God is like what's evolved on this planet? Just a bigger version? Well, of course, for some people it is. God is a bigger version of who they'd like to be, with everybody kowtowing to them and controlling everybody. There are some people like that, and they make God in their image. It's a real problem. We, of course, think about God in terms of a person, a human person. And we know when we do that, we're wrong. But there's not an alternative. This is what symbolism, mythical language does. And as I put it out here, this lovely bird who's actually God, or wants to be God, you know, a bird would think about God as a bird. And a rabbit might think of God as a rabbit. And we think of God as a human being with all the foibles. That's the problem, isn't it? Once you start using imagery, you've got to be really careful, because you might end up saying things that are really a lot of nonsense. Making God in our image, you know, in the ancient world, and we inherit this, they thought about God mainly in male terms, because males were more important than females. Painfully so. Discrimination was up and well and alive, and you know that. So God is like a father who tells you what to do and punishes you if you don't do what you're meant to do. Powerful male, or like a great king. And this was so dominant, you know, and it, you know, we can't help it. It dominates our liturgies. It dominates our religious language. God as king. Sang a song on Sunday about God as king of the... Yeah, well, you see, that's all coming from this kind of thing. Big male king. And as I say, at worst, it's an image of God which is awful. And the image of God as a self-centered person who's preoccupied with wanting everybody to adore him is just a mirror of what this guy really wants to be in life. He wants to have all the control. He wants everybody to admire him. The guy's sick. But he's made God in his image, and if he's got that image of God reinforces that model of being. Real great dangers in the way we think about God. Jesus was really quite naughty about the fact that he took king and he turned it upside down. Like kingdom of God, he didn't talk about it in terms of power, he talked about it in terms of love. And Father, he didn't talk about it in terms of, you know, telling people off and beating them up, some kind of abuse, but he talked about God as compassionate and caring. That was quite different. But our rituals, our ways of doing things are copied from court rituals. No question about that. Our liturgies, right through to the notion of bowing and praying. I mean, I'm into prayer, but just think about this for a moment. The idea of praying in a court where the sovereign is sitting up there somewhere on a high throne, is that you want to distract him and get him to, it'll be a hymn, get him to sort of respond. Beg him, pray that he'll do that. What does that tell you about that image of God? So we really, what are we going to do? Get rid of churches, get rid of altars, get rid of... I mean, my approach is not to say we will fall silent. My approach is to say, let's embrace the rich tradition we have and let's criticize it. Let's be critical about the way we use it so we don't end up reinforcing values that are contrary to the values of Jesus. But just recognise that the church over 2,000 years has been talking about God mainly based on court rituals and like we're even prepared to say, some of us, that we don't actually need a monarch. You know, blessed Charles, but we don't need a king. Or if we do have a king, we'll have one that won't have any power. We're really not into, well, most of us are not into wanting to have a leader whom we can adore and, you know, make a great fuss of. We actually don't like politicians who are full of themselves. Our values have changed. And we don't like dads who are forever bossing their kids about and their wives and abusing them and all about punishment to get control and have good behaviour. We don't like that parenting at all. So when we talk about God using traditional language, we've got to all the time be doing adjustments. And those of us who are carrying the tradition need to be aware of that and to be critical. And one of the common ways that people have talked about God when they've wanted to talk about love is to say, well, you know, God got persuaded to forgive us because he really wasn't happy about doing that, because people had sinned and they needed to be punished. So there was an arrangement where he got Jesus to be punished on the cross. So then God was relieved of the problem and was prepared to love and forgive people. Now think about that. That's a terrible, terrible gospel. It's a terrible, terrible gospel. And it's not the gospel of Jesus. Jesus didn't go about in his ministry in Galilee saying, I'll come to you, tax gatherers and sinners, but you've got to make up for what you did. Get somebody beaten up and really punished, and then I'll feel my desire to have punishment done will be satisfied, and I'll be prepared to come and eat. And Jesus didn't do that. He went out and he ate with tax gatherers and sinners. He reached out to people who were marginalised, but also marginalised themselves. He reached out to awful people who were ripping people off like Zacchaeus. And he didn't do it because somebody had been punished first. So the wonderful ways in which the early church began to look at the death of Jesus and say, you know, this is like a sacrifice. You know how a sacrifice has this impact? His death has unleashed love and forgiveness for us. They used all those kind of images of sacrifice. But then people later took them up and systematized them and turned them into horror shows, really, where God is awful, really awful. Needed to be persuaded to love. And the best of our Gospels, of course, at the heart of them is to say, no, God is love. God cares. I couldn't find a lamb, so that's a goat. The picture, you can't see the picture, no. Our best images of God, think about it, our best images of God really come from people. I mean, who do we really admire these days? I mean, just thinking about these days, we actually hold very highly and very high regard people who are generous and loving and caring and flexible, don't we? We don't mean people who are naive and say everything's okay and sweep things under the carpet just to keep the peace. We don't mean that. We admire the people who are prepared to stand up for what is right, who are prepared to reach out to those who are poor, who are prepared to really love. I mean, that's the model That's much better. We're much more convinced by that these days, and I think the wider world is too, generally, than we are that somebody is great because they've got a birth line that goes back through monarchies, and that's all nonsense. Or they've got a whole lot of money. And our best images of God, of course, are already there in the ministry of Jesus. You know, Jesus turned the kingship thing on its head. Mark really understood that so well, and when Peter was saying, oh, look, no, if you're the king, if you're the Messiah, you're going to succeed, and Jesus said, quite shocking, get behind me, Satan. Like you're on the wrong side altogether, Peter. You've missed the point. And rather shockingly, Jesus says, well, the Son of Man didn't come to be served. I didn't come to be served. Get it? I didn't come for you to admire me. That's not what I'm about. I came to serve. I came to love and to give my life. And then he ends the gospel, you know, in shattering kind of confrontation. Who's crowned? He's crowned, yes, there he is, he's crowned, but a crown of thorns, a dirty trick. And this is an anti-king model. He's on a throne, it's a cross. Oh, that's so confronting and so subversive in the world of their time and in the world of our time. So we can make our images of God based on the kind of thing we see in Jesus. And we really need to acknowledge, you know, church is a minority, okay, but we need to acknowledge that there are lots of people out there in the wider world who think this too. That the real value, the really valuable person, the kind of living that we admire is generosity and love. Oh, they might want to put a Jesus label on it, but that doesn't matter. It's the Jesus stuff. It's the Jesus orientation, the Jesus way of talking about God. So when, for me, my faith in God is really about seeking to stay connected and open to God, like the energy that flows through the universe, or, you know, that's all about being open to the kind of love which I choose to believe is at the heart of God. Now that's a choice. I make that choice. I have no proof of that. It's reasonable, I think. It's reasonable to say that this universe isn't a dirty trick by some bad God up there, but it's actually the product upheld, infused by love and generosity. Now, is that just because I'm a person who's not suffering from all kinds of illnesses and don't have a whole lot of disabilities? Would I be able to think like that if I was on my deathbed, or if I and my family were really poverty-stricken? Well, it would make sense to me if I actually met people who actually were showing love and showing caring. And what I'm really challenging myself about is this comfortable for you, Bill, to say, because you're actually relatively comfortable? That's that, you know, be critical about that. It's reasonable to assume that there's more than emptiness beyond and within all of this universe. That it's, why is there nothing I choose to believe because of love? Okay, I may be completely wrong, but I base my life on that, and part of me trying to be whole, and that's a process, is trying to be open to that and not put blocks in it, because as I understand it, this is what it means to, why I was made. This is what it means to be truly human in our world, and then truly useful to other people. I put Dear Kim at the bottom of the slide, which you can't see, but it doesn't matter. There it is. Dear Kim is something Dear Kim, this is what I believe, is something I wrote about 20 years ago or more. It's on my website, and lots of people use it. And it deals with questions about God and Jesus, the kind of questions we're dealing with. This is not the same as that, that if you want to do some reading, that would be further reading that may be useful for you. But let me stop, and we'll have some questions and discussions and comments, and let's see how we go, and then we will draw to a close. And Andrew was saying to me earlier, I sometimes finish at 9:45 instead of 9 o'clock. We may just do that. And you can go out into the wonderful wet and cold. So, any questions or comments? Does it make sense?
Bill, I really support what you were saying about the idea of an angry God who needed to punish Jesus in our place. But I'd love you to, I may not hear the next talk, so I'd love you to just extend a little bit for me as to how love, which is obviously your stream of thinking, enters into the tragedy of that cross.
Yeah, I think it's really important. I mean, for me, my understanding historically, and I will be talking historically as well as otherwise about Jesus, is that Jesus held this vision of compassion. This was his hope, but also his agenda, and was prepared to go through with it. And the problem was that if you're saying society needs to be ordered differently, it needs to have love at the centre of it, you're saying to your elevated Roman rulers, you've got it wrong. You're asking for trouble when you do that. And he was just one of many who were just wiped out like ants, you know. Give them a good wipe. Kill them off. That's only part of the story. So the crucifixion was coming from, good common sense from the Roman point of view, because they wanted stability and peace on the eastern flank. People from Iran had invaded not so many years before Jesus, and so you've got to keep it stable. And the last thing you want is any movements that are going to call the administration into question. And you're too busy to look into all the details. So Jesus is one of them, John the Baptist, there's a few other people. They all come in that file that says it's best to keep these people silent or shut them up. And the best way to shut them up, actually a much more effective way, is not to kill them, but to put them up on a cross, let them die, just as people come into the supermarket, as it were, and they see it up on the hill, and it's a deterrence. Make it cruel, so it's a real deterrence, so they won't raise questions about the integrity and justice of the Roman Empire. I mean, you can see that I could go on and say a lot about that, but I will say more about it next week. Yeah.
Yes, in that line, I think the Romans had the attitude of, if you oppose us, that's just madness.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Because the Roman way is the way of the world, and that's how you think. So you're uncomfortable with substitutionary atonement, propitiation, any of those sort of concepts?
What I would say is that most of the misuse of those terms and of that thinking comes at a later stage. But what you've got in, say, Paul, who uses a lot of different images, you can't fit them all together. They're images, yeah? And we need to understand what they are doing. And of course, if you do follow the logic of those, you're going to end up with substitutionary atonement and all of that. I think we need to acknowledge that there are problems with that. Lots of our hymns and songs have got them, and yeah.
Isn't that part of the problem? The problem of systematic theology that tries to force the Bible into this rigid system of belief?
Well, I mean, yes, in that sense, when theology does that, takes bits of the Bible and systematizes them, like they are ad hoc writings, yeah? situational. But when you take the images from Paul and then you sit down and work it all out with Lego, and that's the shape of it, you will end up with awful stuff. And if that's what doing theology means for some people, it's not good news. Doing theology, I think, with integrity is to say, hey, let's understand what's going on there. Let's ask what actually was there earlier, and let's critique that too, because it won't all be good. Yeah.
I guess what I struggle with a lot with all the substitution and atonement and that whole line of thinking is that it so separates us from God. It just fundamentally starts from the place of saying you're cut off instead of you're connected. And I believe in Jesus' vision of saying I'm one with the Father is an absolute encouragement for us to know that and to live into that and to proclaim that deeply, to do the great commandment, loving God with our all. And that's why, to me, I can't do it either, Bill, because I think we are a part of the full unworking of God, whatever that is. We're not separated from it to discover it.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the gospel of love is actually about reaching out to everyone where we're at. It can mean reaching out to people who are destitute. It can mean reaching out to people who are awful. It can mean reaching out to people with love, which sees them as they are, and they will hate you for it. I don't want to be seen as I am. I've got a very good image that I've built up. So, yeah, sometimes we need to be with people where they will have a sense of distance from God, alienated, and that's okay too. I mean, I want to put in a plea for being very tolerant about, the various images. Like, Christ died for me. Yeah, I can say that. Do I put that into an arithmetical equation? No, I don't. Do I mean by that his life and his death was also for me and for you? And yeah, I can. So, learning how to use the imagery. But I think for people who lead worship and, carry the tradition, that responsibility, we need to be careful that we don't perpetuate things. See, in religious languages mainly, we are mainly in religious language, we do not believe what we say. That's to say, we mean something else. That's just the way it is, because our images are broken and always inadequate. We will always be kind of, we'll always be taking a risk. It'll always be inadequate. But we need to know that,
Just that left, because we're talking about language,
yeah.
Left and right hemisphere thing again. Left hemisphere uses language, and then it confuses the language spoken with the reality that is, because that's as far as it can see. It lives in a model world made up by itself, and its job is to make a model of the world. That then helps me to realise, all of our language, yours as well, and mine, when we talk about these models that are not good enough, and yet we grab another model and use it and put it on everything, the love and the... we're always trying to fit reality into our words about reality, and it will always be not enough.
Yeah.
And it will always be sort of miss the point. So if I read what you just said then that way, I go, yeah, I think that's true. But it also seems to be a struggle for humans that is what our job is, to make a model of the world and to clarify it and rectify it and sort of keep trying to build it better or closer to fitting reality at least. So I find I'm struggling always to put words to it and then to try and rearrange them and listen to what others understand by that and say it a different way. And I think that's what you're saying too.
Yeah,
is that right?
Yeah, it is. I mean, one of the other ways we would talk about that is don't just operate from your head, operate from your heart. But actually it's better to almost say left brain, right brain. Like right brain, in as much as you buy into that stuff, it's a bit controversial, but I think it's coming back, is a way of perceiving and sensing reality. But it is sensing reality. And left brain is a way of trying to give it a label, express it. We need both. Yeah.
One of the things, though, Bill, and I know it's the way my mind works, is that many years ago I was reading scientific philosophy, and one of the only comments I can tell you that I remember from that period is one of the systematic guys, he was drawing a lot of threads together, and he said, look, knowledge is only a progression from what we do know to what we can know. And that really stuck with me, because people like me have to come to a conclusion about my model of reality so that I can actually do something. And so I'm willing to reshape my model as I move, but I'm also going to take a photograph, if you like, now of what makes sense to me, what I can live with, and what will delight me and give me energy and power to do something. If I'm totally skeptical, right, of everything, and I was hearing some of this from you tonight, then I'm in no man's land. I haven't got my model to work with, and I'm just going to stay skeptical and do nothing.
Yep. It's paralysing. Yep. Josh.
And I love the idea of it's from Rumi that says the greatest form of learning for Rumi is actually unlearning. And I think so too with all things we do with faith and unnaming, because our words are inadequate, and we don't have to be so linear in how we go on the journey, and we go in every which direction. We've got to be willing to let go and to rename and to unlearn and to find anew. And yeah, I'm just hearing a lot of that in what we're talking about tonight, Bill.
And we do need to make decisions and commitments. Acknowledging the fallibility of our thinking, we will nevertheless want to say, I think actually God is loving. Oh, you can't prove that, Bill. But I'm choosing to embrace that. I think it has all sorts of implications. I think scientifically, philosophically, it's reasonable, like it's not an unreasonable possibility. But for me, it's more than a possibility. I've actually chosen to say, I think it's a reality. But that's my fallibility. I made that choice.
Yeah, I struggle a little bit. I guess I'm coming from a background where I grew up, we are all sinners, Jesus died to save us. And I know when I was younger, I really struggled with that, because I thought, what sin, like in the very personal sense, what sin have I committed, And I wouldn't say I was perfect, but I couldn't see that I'd done anything bad enough to warrant somebody having to die as the punishment for it, if you can follow where I'm going with that. And I think then when I got older, I realised, well, sin was much bigger than me telling a fib to get away with eating a chocolate biscuit I shouldn't have eaten, or, something like that. But I think I still struggle as I'm communicating. Even today we were talking about sin with Year 8 students. And it was, what's wrong with the world? They came up with a great list. And it was lovely, Ben, who was teaching the lesson, ended up quoting G.K. Chesterton to say, what's wrong with the world? I am. But I think that's part of the problem. We have such an inadequate and almost trivialised sense of what sin is. So then God's punishment is then also overbearing and ogre-like. So how do we explain the concept of sin in a way that helps us understand the enormity of it, and in a way that then helps us see how great the love of God is, without bringing it down to this kind of trivialised version that is a nonsense, I think, at least. So I'm not sure how that's a question, but I think it's what I keep trying to work through.
I mean, my first profound response is to say, we'll find out what you've done wrong, and we'll tell you about your sins. Yeah, we can do that. I'm sure we can check the family.
I think I've done a few things more wrong than stealing chocolate biscuits since, but,
I have to go.
You have to. What have you done wrong? He's got to pick up his wife.
Oh yes, each one went out.
Yeah. It is really interesting. Parenting has changed over the last 100 years, last 50 years in particular. And when really for centuries, families were dominated by the father and by rules. And the father was often the punishing one. So guilt was a big thing, Now, we are into new generations where guilt is not such a big thing. So in a way, when we talk about Jesus dying for our sins, we will have kids saying, well, what about, what sins, It's also helpful. Paul is helpful here. He says, look, I don't want to talk about sins. I want to talk about the state of sin. And the state of sin is the state of alienation from God and from yourself. And the result of that is that you do things that actually are not consistent with love and wholeness and aren't good for you and aren't good for other people. Paul really was very good at that, writing in the 50s, before the Gospels. And I think that helps us too. And when you look at the ministry of Jesus, forgiveness of sins plays a role, but it's not, he wasn't going around it wasn't the first thing he was talking about necessarily. It was love and restoration, which included forgiveness. And after all, forgiveness of sins was there for everybody in John the Baptist's ministry. Sometimes we forget that. If we really think the main thing about Jesus was forgiveness of sins for all, we're actually saying he had nothing new to offer. Because John the Baptist offered universal forgiveness of sins. So that's another illustration of missing the point about Jesus. Jesus was on about restoration, which included forgiveness, but it was about much more than that. And it's much more exciting. Now, there's two more questions.
Andrew.
Andrew.
We have a question from our YouTube chat from James. is there a common language we can use in communicating God to our culture today?
That's a really good question, and I think it's going to depend which part of our culture we're talking to. I think, you know, with some people we're talking, they've got a God language in already, so it's, you know, you have to work with that God language. For other people, it'll be, I mean, I'm really picking things. You could go all over the place with this. People who are concerned about their environment would have, you know, a pretty good understanding of, hey, yeah, this is actually about being one with the world out there, and a sense of, yeah, we can use the word God if you like, oneness with God in creation. So there are all different ways of doing that, but it's a helpful kind of question. And what we do need to do is to think about what we actually do think, and not just reproduce court language about God, which is really not very helpful. And one last question, yes.
No, it was a comment, so
A comment.
we can leave it if we're at the end.
Okay, well now folks, I think we are done. Thank you for participating. I'm going to be talking about Jesus, and I'm going to talk about Jesus historically, and then what happened to Jesus. I mean, one of the real challenges is that human beings tend to want to idolize people. I think some of you have heard me tell the story of Shane Warne. You all know Shane Warne was a spinner, and he was in a nightclub in the UK, and a woman came up to him and said, Shane, I've been a fan of yours for years. I wish I could play golf like you. And the point is that, you know, when people make it sound like Jesus was on an ego trip, he was really wanting all the admiration, he would be appalled, I'm sure. What happens so often is that, I didn't know Jesus was interested in that, you know. So we'll be doing some thinking about how we think about Jesus, and hopefully trying to be in touch with what we think historically were his priorities. You see, I want to say the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ be with you all. And I do that. I'm doing it. I mean, I do note that I know what the words mean, but I'm actually doing it. If you understand what I mean, blessings on you.